session. It's my pleasure to introduce one of the brightest lights in the Green Party movement in Alberta. Is my shadow cabinet colleague, our justice critic, Dr. Cameron Jefferies. Cameron is an associate professor with the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. His work focuses on matters of international and domestic environmental law, oceans and law policy, wildlife conservation, and climate change. He is the author of Marine Mammal Conservation and the Law of the Sea. That's an Oxford University Press publication in 2016, and co-editor of Global Environmental Change and Innovation in International Environmental Law, and that's a Cambridge University Press publication in 2018. His work has also appeared in leading journals and edited collections. He has presented his work nationally and internationally, and he has been recognized as an award-winning teacher and researcher. He previously worked as a research associate at the Health Law Institute and qualified as a lawyer with the Edmonton firm of Field LLP. He earned his doctorate in law at the University of Virginia, where he studied as a Fulbright scholar. He is passionate about local environmental education and advocacy and is the Green Party of Alberta candidate of record in St. Albert. Cameron, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Jefferies, and I am a law professor at the University of Alberta and also the Green Party of Alberta Justice Critic in the Shadow Cabinet. It's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Ms. Tiera Williams. Tiera was born and raised in Edmonton, is the founder of A Fight for Equity, and a key organizer in Alberta's Black Lives Matter movement. This past summer, Tiera co-organized Canada's largest Black Lives Matter demonstration here in the city of Edmonton. The pursuit of justice takes many forms and often starts with pressures that emerge from organized civil society. Today, we have an opportunity to listen to Tiera talk about next steps and the importance of developing policies that directly address police brutality and systemic racism here in the province of Alberta. The Green Party of Alberta stands in solidarity with Tiera and the Black Lives Movement, and it is my pleasure to introduce her, and I regret that I'm not there in person to welcome her to the stage. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Hi, my name is Tiera Williams, and I am the co-founder of A Fight for Equity. On June 5th, I, with the support of my team and some amazing people in my community, threw one of Canada's largest peaceful protests in support of the Black Lives Matter movement across the globe. This inspired our organization, A Fight for Equity, to be created. Growing up, I've always been passionate about human rights and have always cared deeply for others. At the tender age of 7, I experienced racism for the first time in Alberta and was educated on what racism is and on Black history, and that's when my passion for activism was born. The past 7 months, I've been working within my community, connecting and building bridges as we continue the fight for equity. I'd like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity, and although I cannot be there with you live, I appreciate you giving me this platform to speak on systemic racism and police brutality and what I believe needs to be done to create a more equitable and diverse system that treats everyone fairly. You asked me to speak on what kind of policies Greens can bring about at the provincial level to tackle police brutality and systemic racism. I think it's important that we first define what exactly systemic racism is. Systemic comes from the word system. The definition of system is an established way of doing things that is done so often that it does not require any individual to run it. It runs itself. Systemic racism has become a well-oiled machine, and it's been oppressing and keeping people of color down for hundreds of years. Racism has 2 definitions. 1 is racism at an individual level, and 2 at a systemic level. We cannot successfully treat cancer by treating only the symptoms, which in this case is racism at an individual level. We must first treat the cancer, which is systemic racism. Racism was designed to uphold an economic and social system for those at the top of society. White men and women are the ones who benefit from this system. The purpose of racism was to profit the white race, especially rich white men, and it was an easy way to get power and wealth. You ask what I believe the Green Party of Alberta can do to tackle police brutality and systemic racism, and it's not one simple answer. Police brutality and systemic racism go hand in hand. You always hear people talking about this broken system, but in my opinion, it's not broken at all. It's working exactly the way it was built, to oppress racialized folks. People think the answer to police brutality is to fire all of the racist officers in the police force. While that may be momentarily effective, you can take all the racists out of the system, and the system is still racist. By dismantling the current systems in place, it gives us opportunities to create better systems that are more equitable for everyone. In order to take the necessary steps towards building a new system, we must first acknowledge that systemic racism exists in Alberta and Canada. When people in powerful positions, such as, for example, when the Alberta RCMP Deputy Commissioner Curtis Zablocki went on record this year and said that he doesn't believe that racism in policing is systemic in Alberta or Canada, it is incredibly concerning and extremely hurtful to people of color across Canada. This is someone openly admitting that because it isn't his experience, that Canada doesn't have this problem, failing to recognize the little bit of statistics that Canada does have that shows overwhelming evidence that we do in fact have systemic racism in both the police force and the RCMP across Canada, and that the majority of police-involved deaths and brutality cases have an overwhelming overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous victims, and the majority of them were suffering mental health crises at the time of their deaths. We need people like Curtis, who have a direct hand in the way the system is run, to educate themselves on white privilege and systemic racism. Just because your experience is different than people like myself does not mean that you can invalidate our truths and experiences with systemic racism in the police system. Believe me when I say it exists. On February 1st, 1920, the Canadian RCMP was created to assert sovereignty over Indigenous people and their land. Their job was to clear the plains and the prairies of Indigenous people, displacing them onto reserves whether they wanted to go or not. The force was created to stop any opposition to its vision of a successful colonial state, and those who resisted were starved onto the reserves. The federal government then created the Indian Act and used the RCMP to forcibly kidnap Indigenous children from their homes and force them into residential schools where they would be stripped of their culture, their languages, beaten, sexually abused, and colonized. Looking at the history of just the RCMP alone and how little the system has changed, it is no surprise that racialized folks have such a disconnected relationship when it comes to the RCMP and the police. Many are still healing from this today. We are still using the same systems that were first created to oppress people of color in Canada. We must dismantle these oppressive systems and rebuild them, starting from the way that officers are trained to introducing new policies that hold them accountable when they do something wrong. A few things that we could focus on for both the RCMP and police is creating a system that holds police officers accountable for their actions. Countless times we see scenarios where police are being held at a higher regard than the law. This treatment tells the community that they are above the law and can get away with making fatal mistakes, especially when it comes to racialized folks. An example of this is the Starlight Tours and the RCMP. To this day, no charges have been laid in the deaths of several Indigenous people at the hands of police, one of whom was only 17 years old. We know the details of Canada's dark history and still no accountability. On November 16, 2020, during a city council meeting, the Edmonton Chief of Police Dale McPhee stated that even he agrees that holding the police accountable is extremely important. A way to successfully hold police accountable is by making police misconduct public record. If an officer has a history of using excessive force, it should be put on record. This would allow patterns to be discovered, and the bad apples of the police force can appropriately be disciplined. Unnecessary force in the police system is a huge issue, especially towards Black and Indigenous people. 85% of police training is focused on physical contact. This creates violent interactions with police and the public. More than 15% of police training needs to be dedicated to de-escalation tactics. And if we're going to continue to use officers for mental health emergencies, we need to put more training into teaching officers how to recognize and support someone in a mental health crisis without using brutal force, as well as cultural sensitivity training and anti-racism classes at every level of the judicial system that is reoccurrent every single year. It takes 3 to 10 years of schooling to work with mental health illnesses and addictions before being able to come in contact and treat a client. And yet our police are the first point of contact in many of these situations, and they don't have adequate training or even basic training on how to spot a mental health or addiction crisis. Why would anyone suffering a mental health crisis ever want to call the police for help when statistics say that they are more likely to die in the hands of police than during a mental health emergency when they are Black or Indigenous? As I briefly mentioned earlier, all across Canada there's an overwhelming amount of fatalities involving police and racialized folks while they are experiencing mental health emergencies. 70% of police-involved killings since the year 2000 were during mental health and addiction crises. Per capita, Black and Indigenous people are overwhelmingly overrepresented in these police killings. Mental health is not a crime, nor should it be a death sentence. We must address this very real issue. Racial profiling in policing is another dangerous and potentially life-threatening issue that I believe is extremely important to acknowledge and address. We refer to this practice in policing as carding. Carding is a dangerous issue that takes place daily in Edmonton and in cities across Canada. Racial profiling is something that occurs by police when the officer consciously or subconsciously subjects a person to an unlawful investigation or different treatment, depending on the officer's racial biases or racist stereotypes that they believe, rather than reasonable grounds of suspicion. I asked my father if he remembers a time of being pulled over and racially profiled in Alberta, and he said every time. And that's the reality for many of us, especially Black and Indigenous men across Canada. On November 19, 2020, the government of Alberta declared they are ending carding effective immediately. This is long overdue, and in 2020, the Alberta government has finally acknowledged it exists. It is important that zero-tolerance policies are put in place immediately to hold officers caught racially profiling accountable, along with cultural sensitivity training and race relations training in all police departments across Alberta to ensure this is done appropriately and effectively. My friend said it perfectly when she said, "The education police require to be a cop doesn't allow their mindsets to grow past their prejudices. It is time to update the whole training process to better accommodate everyone, not just a selected few." In my closing statements, I would like to address the extreme lack of data collection when it comes to people of color and police statistics across Alberta and Canada. Canada has a very real problem with erasure culture. We do it with our homeless community and we do it with our police, which makes it difficult when finding accurate information. If we want to find information on the amount of deaths that happen at the hands of the RCMP and Canadian police to racialized Canadians, we have to gather the data ourselves from the information released by media, which isn't always accurate, especially when not every case is reported. Therefore, we don't get the full picture of what has taken place across our country to our people. We deserve to have a clear picture of what's taking place in our province with our people, with people of color and police. We must stop erasure culture in Canada. These issues are only the tips of the iceberg when it comes to addressing how to rebuild a system that has been built to oppress and hurt racialized people in Canada. Unfortunately, there is much more to address and so much work to be done and so little time to address it. I'm grateful to be given this platform to speak on some of the things that I believe we need to address and change in order to ensure a more equitable future for the racialized citizens of Canada. I look forward to seeing the positive changes the Alberta Green Party brings to our province, if given the chance. I would like to thank you all for your time today. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, much thanks and gratitude are extended to Tiera Williams for that wonderfully uplifting and important keynote speeches. So there are keynote speeches and then there are keynote speeches, and this was a very important one for the people of Alberta and our party. Social justice and respect for diversity are two Green Party values that are embedded in our collective DNA, and we look forward to continuing to work with you, Tiera, and to others to achieve equity in Alberta and